Спасибо.
Thank you, President. We welcome your personal participation in the Council's discussion today on the question of addressing the historical injustice regarding the participation of African states in the work of the UN Security Council. We listened very carefully to the briefings from the Secretary-General and the President of the General Assembly. We're also grateful to Ms. Mabete for her useful analysis of the situation in terms of addressing the historical injustice vis-à-vis Africa. This topic is particularly important to us because the Russian Federation was one of the most consistent allies of Security Council reform in order that its membership reflect the multipolar nature of the contemporary world. Our basic attitude on this important question has not undergone any changes since the beginning of the reform process in 2009. We unequivocally advocate for an expansion of the Council solely to include developing countries from Africa, Asia and Latin America. We see that this is a logical and long overdue step towards addressing the historical injustice, primarily vis-à-vis states from the African continent. The current makeup of the Council in no way corresponds to the overall number of states in Africa, nor the contemporary role of Africa in international affairs. At the same time, I think we all agree that a reformed Security Council must remain effective and authoritative. For this, its membership should not be too broad. It's clear that the Security Council, from 25 to 30 members, will not be able to effectively fulfill its mandate. Moreover, it should retain the effective mechanism that was laid down in the Charter by the UN founders, the veto. It is this instrument that guarantees that the Security Council takes balanced and realistic decisions that determine the prospects for conflict resolution in various regions of the world. It is also utilised inter alia in the interests of Africa. For example, exactly a year ago, when a Russian veto meant that an extension of an irrelevant counterproductive sanctions against Mali could be avoided. President, unfortunately, in recent years, we've observed from some of our colleagues quite a conjectural approach in terms of including new representatives of Africa in the membership of the Council. If you look closely at their arguments, then it's easy to see that they are more concerned with ensuring that alongside countries from the Global South, they also include NATO allies in the pool of permanent members. At the same time, it is clear as day that Western countries who are committed to acting as a bloc have already significantly overrepresented at the Security Council. We call on our African colleagues to be alert to this and not make a mistake. And make no mistake, addressing the historic injustice vis-à-vis Africa, while in parallel including new Western members in the Security Council, will not work. For this, the proportion of African and overall developing countries would have to be significantly increased compared with their former colonial capitals and allies, who are trying at any cost and without any justification to preserve their dominant position in international affairs. President, it is our conviction that redressing the historical injustice regarding Africa should not be limited to Security Council reform, because this grim state of affairs is also reflected in other key issues of the multilateral world order, issues that have no less, perhaps more significance for the inherent interests of Africa. We see clearly against the backdrop of their ebbing hegemony, the Western countries, in as much as they can in the spirit of colonial times, are trying to preserve their privileged positions. The consequences of colonialism affect all spheres of life in African society and are a real hindrance to countries of the continent from acquiring a durable role in international affairs. Direct oppression has been replaced by sophisticated forms of neo-colonialism, here entrenching the commodity-based nature of economies, harsh IMF programs, and the brain drains. These factors just compound economic underdevelopment, poverty, and political instability in African countries. There is also direct limitations on development and sometimes on the sovereignty of borrowing countries, that is the growing debt burden. According to UNCTAD data, the overall debt of Africa over 12 years has increased by 183% to 1.8 trillion US dollars, which is 4 times higher than the national GDP growth across the continent. We can't ignore either the critical question for the African continent, that is the problem of mobilizing domestic financing for development. Africa loses up to 150 billion US dollars every year through the siphoning off of assets, the majority of which sit in Western countries or in jurisdictions that they control. There is also a negative impact on development caused by unlawful restrictive measures which currently affect 9 African countries. And this injustice and neo-colonial discrimination is something that the Western countries don't wish to address, and they prefer to hold forth about with their own theories. We strongly believe that economic support for developing countries from Western countries is not a gesture of goodwill. It's a moral debt for the injustice of the exploitative colonial system of the past and the international financial system of today. Since despite their grand statements of Western donors, the amount of development assistance remains meagre, lower than the 0.7% of GNP required in line with international obligations. Around this issue, there is still lively debate at the negotiations on the draft Pact of the Future. The problem of a lack of representation in the Global South in the managing structures, not only of the Bretton Woods structures, but also UN development institutions, funds and programs, is loud and clear. It's unacceptable when, for decades, management positions are being held by representatives of one regional group, and the secretariats of financial institutions are de facto being privatized by the biggest donors. We trust that with the assistance of the co-facilitators negotiation process, one of which is Namibia, the progress that is so necessary to democratize the global governance system will be achieved. President. Against the backdrop of the worsening general humanitarian situation in Africa, the blatant politicization of the provision of humanitarian assistance from Western donors is surprising. Thus, the UN appeals for many African countries in 2023 were only funded to a level of 20 to 30%, and these same trends are continuing this year. At the same time, for example, in Ukraine, which is an exporter of food, the humanitarian appeal had record levels of funding, 70 or more %. It's also clear that the amount of Western military assistance to Ukraine could easily plug the hole in the majority of UN African humanitarian plans, improving the lives of hundreds of millions of people. However, Western politicians and business people prefer, rather than that, to provide weapons in hotspots and increasing the suffering of people. A similar state of affairs has been observed in international efforts on peace building too. We note that Western donors provide financial support primarily to projects that tie in with their own priorities, when the real needs of African countries regarding infrastructure and technology are often overlooked. Is this actually not just a manifestation of the historical injustice towards Africa? It is high time to put an end to this and move to a just world order, redressing the artificial imbalance from the past, when the majority of Africa was still colonized. Some steps in the right direction have been taken. The recent inclusion of the AU in the G20 and also the expansion of BRICS, largely for African countries. There's no doubt that this will provide opportunities to take the continent's priorities more into account in discussions on key global questions at this platform. Going directly to the topic of our meeting, I'd like to say that there are a lot of practical steps that really would strengthen the voice of African councils in our council today, so they don't have to wait for agreements on the Security Council to be made. Thus, an obvious relic of the old colonial logic at the Council, which is the current distribution of pen holderships for country and regional files between former colonial powers. There is a very disappointing situation in place where the majority of peoples in Africa have gained independence, but their former colonizers are still keeping an eye on them from the Council chamber. For years, we have consistently denounced this unfortunate situation, and any efforts to try and address this are being sabotaged by Western countries. President, in conclusion, I would like to underscore that the USSR was always a sincere and true friend of Africa, helping it free itself from the shackles of colonialism and exploitation and stand firmly on its own 2 feet. Today, this friendly and constructive line towards Africa is being continued by Russia. Therefore, our African friends can always count on our support and assistance. And also that we will continue to expose those, as we say, on the back of Africa, try to drag new Western members into the Security Council, and in doing so, try to maintain their influence at the Council and in the world as a whole, so that they can continue to exploit your states and hinder their development. Thank you for your attention.